The story of African free people of color in 18th-century French Guiana is one of navigating a complex and often restrictive society, where freedom was constantly challenged by social and legal barriers. During this period, French Guiana was a colonial outpost in South America, reliant on a plantation economy that used enslaved African labor to cultivate crops like sugar, coffee, and indigo. While the majority of people of African descent in the colony were enslaved, a small but significant group of African free people of color managed to obtain freedom through manumission, birth to free parents, or military service. Despite their status as free individuals, the African free people of color faced a range of legal and social restrictions that limited their opportunities and autonomy. French colonial society in the 18th century was highly stratified, with racial and social hierarchies strictly enforced. The Code Noir, a set of laws governing the treatment of enslaved Africans and free people of color in French colonies, set forth regulations that maintained the superiority of white colonists and restricted the freedoms of non-whites. For example, African free people of color were often prohibited from engaging in certain professions, owning property in desirable areas, or carrying weapons. These limitations forced many free people of color to find work in occupations deemed acceptable for their status, such as artisans, laborers, or small-scale traders. Some found employment in the militia or as skilled craftsmen, roles that afforded a modest income and relative security. However, their social mobility remained limited, as colonial authorities imposed restrictions on wealth accumulation, land ownership, and participation in civic life. This left them in a precarious position, constantly struggling to defend the freedoms they had managed to secure. The social challenges extended beyond legal constraints to everyday interactions, where African free people of color faced discrimination from both the white population and the enslaved. Whites often viewed them as a threat to the social order, fearing that they would inspire enslaved people to seek freedom or revolt. As a result, free people of color were closely monitored and subjected to various forms of discrimination, such as excessive taxation or arbitrary legal judgments. The colonial government also enacted sumptuary laws regulating the clothing and lifestyle of free people of color to prevent them from appearing too affluent or challenging the visual markers of social hierarchy. Despite these difficulties, African free people of color managed to create and sustain their own communities. They formed mutual aid societies, established small businesses, and maintained cultural traditions that distinguished them from both the white and enslaved populations. Family networks played a crucial role in providing social and economic support, and marriages within their group helped maintain community cohesion. Over time, some free people of color acquired small plots of land or even owned slaves, reflecting the complex and sometimes contradictory nature of their status in colonial society. Religion also provided a space for African free people of color to assert their identity. Many embraced Catholicism, which was the dominant religion in French Guiana, but they often incorporated African spiritual practices and beliefs into their worship. Churches served as places where free people of color could gather, seek education, and find some degree of acceptance within the wider society. Nevertheless, they were often relegated to segregated seating or separate churches, underscoring the persistent racial divisions. As the 18th century progressed, events in the broader Atlantic world began to influence the lives of African free people of color in French Guiana. The growing movement for abolition, the Haitian Revolution, and changing attitudes towards slavery in Europe sparked hope for greater freedom and equality. However, these changes were slow to reach French Guiana, where colonial authorities continued to resist any reforms that threatened the status quo. The outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789 and the subsequent debates over the rights of free people of color and the abolition of slavery brought temporary hope. In 1794, the National Convention in France abolished slavery in all French colonies, theoretically granting African free people of color full equality. However, the realities of colonial politics meant that these changes were not always implemented, and it was not until slavery was permanently abolished in French Guiana in 1848 that the African free people of color saw significant improvements in their legal and social standing. The story of African free people of color in 18th-century French Guiana highlights their resilience and determination to navigate a society structured against them. Despite legal restrictions and social discrimination, they carved out spaces for autonomy, maintained cultural traditions, and laid the groundwork for future generations to continue the struggle for freedom and equality. Their legacy is a testament to the complexities of colonial life and the enduring fight for justice in a world defined by rigid social hierarchies.